This is the first in a series of videos intended to get you familiar with the raptors that can be found along the Mendocino coast in winter. We're going to start with the accipiters, or as they're sometimes called, accipiters. There are two species, the Cooper's hawk and the sharp-shinned hawk. And that's the good news. There's only two accipiters you have to try to tell apart. The bad news is they're really hard to tell apart. There is a third species, the northern goshawk, but it is extraordinarily rare here on the Mendocino coast. They're both fairly common. This one is the sharp-shinned hawk. And the two key things to notice in this opening picture are the tail and the wings. Sharp-shinned hawks, their tail feathers are of equal length, and that makes the ends of their tails look squared off. They also characteristically have a little crook in their wings, and that makes them look kind of shouldery or wristy when they're soaring. And this is a really good key thing to look for to tell them apart from Cooper's hawks. The other effect that has, their wings are kind of cocked forward a little bit, and that makes them look short-necked. Their head just barely projects beyond their wings when they're soaring. Here's a overhead shot. You sometimes see these birds fly right over you, and the tail is spread, so you can see what I was talking about, that all the tail feathers are of the same length, and that makes the outer corners look squared off. On a Cooper's hawk, those will be rounded, as we'll see in a moment. The other thing to notice here is the chest. On the juvenile accipiters, their chest is streaked, and on the adults, it's kind of an orange barred color. Again, notice that the head on this sharp shin barely projects beyond its wings. If you draw a line from those wrists, from one wrist to another, you'd see that its head barely sticks past that line. Sharp-shinned hawks are wristy. Now when they're perched, it can get a little trickier, but the first thing to notice when you see a perched raptor like this is, what are its wings doing? When they're perched with their backs to you, you can have a lot of challenges in ID, but the very first thing you want to look at is how long are their wings? Where do the wingtips land relative to the end of their tails? On both of the accipiters, the wings are very short, and they land just past the base of the tail. So you got a lot of tail sticking out past the wings on both the sharp-shin and the Cooper's hawks. This one, again, look at that tail and notice that all the tail feathers are the same length. This is a sharp-shinned hawk. The other thing to look at on Sharpies is their heads. They have a small head relative to the rest of the bird, and it's characteristically rounded looking. Dave Jensen says they look like an ice cream scoop. Here's a couple of them looking straight at you. And this is what I was talking about before. The one on the left is the immature bird with that streaked chest. And the one on the right is actually an adult with the sort of orange-brown barring. Kind of a strange, both of these are kind of a strange pose. The birds are fluffed out and got a strange shape. The other thing to notice is look at their legs. When you see a perched accipiter, you can actually tell them apart just by the shape of the legs. Sharp shins have these little thin legs. A lot of people say they're stick-like, but that doesn't help me because sticks come in all sizes and shapes. So I think of them as just little thin legs, whereas the Cooper's has a much more robust leg. And again, they have these rounded heads. The other thing is on the immature birds, which by the way are much more abundant than the mature birds. For some reason in the winter here, we get a lot of immature sharp-shins and Coopers and only a few of the adults. So you need to be able to tell them apart. They're really similar. And one clue is the characteristics of the streaks on their chest and belly. So on the sharp-shinned hawk on the left, you can see the streaks are coarse and blurry. They extend all the way across the chest. Here's two more immature sharp-shins, just to show you some of the range of variation in the streaking on the chest. Again, though, both of these birds have real blurry streaks, like it was drawn on with an old, worn-out Sharpie. And especially on that bird on the left, you can really see that round head shape. And on the one on the right, you can see those little narrow legs. All right, here's the other one. This is the Cooper's hawk. And a good mnemonic for these when you see one soaring overhead is Coopers form a cross. Look at their wing shape. They stick straight out to the sides, and there's hardly any crook at the wrist. These are both immature birds, and you can tell that by the streaking on their chest. And now look at the tails. Notice that the outer tail feathers are actually shorter than the center tail feathers, and this makes their tails look characteristically rounded in flight or perched. Cooper's hawks also look long-tailed when they're flying, especially that bird on the right, really a characteristic look. Their tails actually look longer than the sharp-shins do. And notice that their heads project out beyond their wings quite a bit more than sharp-shins. Here's a couple of perched birds, immature on the left, mature bird on the right. Again, notice the tails. And on the bird on the left, you can really see that that rounded appearance is definitely caused by the feathers being shorter on the outside. You can also see that to a lesser extent on that bird on the right. Now you can't really see their legs very clearly here, and that's pretty common. That's a great clue when you can see it, but often you can't really see their legs very clearly. So the other thing is to look at their heads. Cooper's hawks have a little bit of a flattened head. They're commonly said to have a flat top. And on adult birds, this is accentuated by the fact that their crown is darker than the nape, and that gives them a kind of a crew cut look. So on that immature bird on the left, those streaks are thinner and finer than the ones on the sharp-shinned. It's a subtle clue, but once you see a few of these birds, you start to recognize that. Here again is an immature Cooper's hawk, and notice this one really has a flat-topped head look. Okay, here's a side-by-side of two soaring accipiters. Cooper's on the left, sharp-shin on the right, just to show you the difference in the wing shape. Notice that prominent crooked pattern on the sharp-shin and the cross on the left. Now, in general, accipiters are recognizable because they have short, broad wings, and this sets them apart from the falcons and buteos. Falcons, of course, have long, pointed wings. Buteos have long, rounded wings, and the accipiters have these short, round wings and the characteristic snappy, flappy wing beats. This one is a little more obvious with that square tail. This is another sharp shin. Look at the little thin leg on this bird and that round ice cream scoop head. Here's kind of a tricky bird. This is an adult, you can tell right off the bat from that chest pattern. It does have fairly sturdy looking legs, and look at its head, that dark top, kind of flattish. This is actually an adult Cooper's hawk. Here's another adult, perched in a kind of a confusing tangle. You see these things in your yards a lot. Both of them are bird hunters. They feed almost exclusively on birds that they catch themselves. They won't eat carrion. So you often see them in this pose, perched in your garden, peering intently around in the shrubbery for prey. So you can look down at the tail and see that the feathers are all about the same length, square tail, little legs. This is a sharp shin. It's an adult. Well, here's an interesting and rather difficult bird. This one has just come from taking a bath in a small pond in my garden. And so that's got its feathers all wet and in an odd configuration. It's spreading out its wings and its tail to dry them off. And that makes it a little hard to tell. Are those outer tail feathers the same length, or are the outer ones shorter than the center ones? So you have to kind of visually imagine folding this tail back up. If you do that, you'll kind of see that those outer feathers are shorter than the center feathers. I missed this clue at first, and Adam Hutchins straightened me out on this bird. I had misidentified it. The other thing to notice about those tail feathers before we move off them is those white tips. And Cooper's hawks actually have a fairly broad white tip to their tail feathers, a little bit more so than sharp-shins. The problem is that gets worn off as the bird ages before it molts out new feathers. This is probably an immature bird, and it's probably several months old and has worn off a lot of the white tips. But you see a lot of white in the shoulders and back, and that white patch at the nape. I'm not sure if the nape patch is partial leucism, or if it's just the downy underfeathers poking through because the outer feathers are all wet. But the shoulder patches are pretty typical for immature Cooper's hawks. Sharp-shins will show that as well, but not as blotchy, and the patches aren't as large as they are on this bird. They can be really hard to ID sometimes. This when they're tucked into the trees and bushes, but this one is showing you its tail pretty clearly. This is an adult Cooper's hawk. Again, notice that flat-topped head, and Coopers also have a gray nape, and that can help when you can see it. There you go. I hope that helps. You can go back and review this a few times if you need to. These are really tricky birds in the field, but once you get them, get a little confidence, you can in fact tell them apart. Happy birding!